Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. You are listening to Sleepy Historian, a quiet place where history is allowed to move slowly, without urgency, and without expectation. If this is your first time here, you are very welcome. And if you have been here before, returning again in the soft hours of the night, I am glad you found your way back. Before we begin, allow your body to settle. There's nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to learn, and nothing you need to stay awake for. You can listen as closely as you like, or you can let the words drift past you, like distant footsteps on packed snow. Either way is perfectly fine. Tonight, we're going to spend some time in a medieval village during the depth of winter. Not during moments of drama or action, but during the long, quiet stretches that filled most of people's lives. The kind of winter that arrived without announcement and stayed without apology. The kind that pressed gently but constantly on homes, on bodies, and on thoughts. For medieval villagers, winter was not simply a season on a calendar. It was something felt in the bones and noticed in small changes. The shortening of the day, the way breath lingered longer in the air, the way routines grew narrower and more careful. When winter arrived, people adjusted their movements, their expectations, and often their beliefs. Many of those beliefs might seem strange now. Small rules, quiet rituals, things done not because they were proven, but because they offered a sense of steadiness. In a world where warmth was uncertain and food could not be guaranteed, superstition was often less about fear and more about reassurance. As we move through this story, you may notice that winter is treated almost like a presence, not an enemy and not a villain, but something that shaped daily life in subtle ways. It did not shout, it did not rush, it waited, and people learned over generations how to wait with it. You might imagine a village just after sunset, not the sunset of bright colors and celebration, but a quiet fading. The last tasks of the day are finished carefully with tired hands. Doors are closed earlier than they would be in summer. Fires are checked more than once. The night stretches ahead, long and uninterrupted. In moments like these, superstition often found its place. A certain way of arranging tools near the hearth. A habit of speaking particular words before sleep. A rule about what should be left untouched until morning. These practices did not feel dramatic to those who followed them. They felt practical, familiar, comforting. Some believed that winter listened. Others believed it remembered. And many believed that if they behaved properly, if they respected certain quiet rules, the season might pass a little more gently. Whether or not these beliefs truly changed outcomes mattered less than the calm they provided during the waiting. As we explore these winter superstitions, we will do so slowly. There is no need to hurry from one idea to the next. Like the people we're listening to tonight, we will take our time. We will notice small details. The sound of wind against wooden walls. The dull glow of embers late at night. The feeling of heaviness that came not from fear, but from fatigue. From time to time, you may hear gentle reminders of how difficult winter could be. Not in sharp or unsettling ways, but in quiet acknowledgments. Food sometimes ran low. Warmth sometimes faded. And not every winter ended the same way for everyone. These facts were accepted with a kind of calm honesty. Winter was endured, not challenged. If you find yourself growing sleepy as we go along, that is exactly as it should be. This story is not meant to hold your attention tightly. It is meant to give your thoughts something soft to rest on. If you wake later and remember only fragments, that is perfectly fine. If you are enjoying this kind of slow, restful storytelling, you are welcome to like the video or subscribe to Sleepy Historian. It helps this quiet corner of history reach others who might need it. And if you ever wish to leave a comment, you can do so in your own time. There is no rush. As the night deepens around us, we will begin by looking at winter itself. Not the superstitions yet, but the feeling of the season as it first arrived. The moment when people noticed that things were changing and that life would soon narrow into something smaller, quieter, and more careful. There is no danger in listening, only the slow passing of time and the gentle weight of history settling into place. Now, As you breathe in and out, slowly and evenly, allow the story to begin. The first cold of winter rarely arrived all at once. It did not announce itself with snow or storm. Instead, it came quietly in small signs that were easy to overlook at first. A morning that felt sharper than the one before. A breath that lingered just a little longer in the air. A stiffness in the fingers that took more time to ease. For medieval villagers, these early changes were noticed carefully. Not with alarm, but with attention. Winter was not unexpected. It returned every year. And yet, each year, the body still reacted as if it were new. Muscles tightened sooner in the day. Movement slowed without anyone deciding to slow them. People began to conserve themselves, often without realizing it. The first cold altered routines before it altered beliefs. Tasks were completed earlier. Conversations ended sooner. There was less wandering, less standing still outdoors. Doors were closed more firmly, and latches were checked twice. These actions did not feel like superstition yet. They felt sensible, practical. But alongside these changes, something quieter began to happen in the mind. People started to think differently about time. Summer encouraged openness. Winter encouraged caution. The future felt closer, heavier, more uncertain. A single mistake, a forgotten chore, a poorly sealed roof, a neglected fire, could echo longer in the cold months. And so attention sharpened. This was often the moment when old sayings resurfaced. Words passed down from parents and grandparents. Phrases spoken half seriously, half out of habit. Do not leave the threshold bare when the cold comes. Finish your work before the light fades. These sayings were rarely explained. They did not need to be. They had survived because they felt right. As the air cooled, people began to notice their homes differently. Cracks in walls felt wider. Floors felt colder. The spaces where warmth escaped became more obvious. The house itself seemed to respond to winter, settling and tightening, making its presence known through creaks and quiet sounds in the night. This was when belief began to slip gently into daily life. Not belief in the dramatic sense, but belief as a form of order, a way to feel that something could still be managed, even as the days shortened. Villagers might say that winter tested a household, not with cruelty, but with patience. And so, they prepared in ways that were both physical and mental. Extra care was taken with stored goods. Tools were placed where they would not be misplaced. Certain habits were followed more carefully than before. Some of these habits had practical roots. Others had roots that were harder to trace. Why a broom was left standing in a certain corner. Why ashes were smoothed a particular way before bed. Why certain tasks were never begun after dusk once the cold had arrived. The first cold made people listen more, not only to the weather, but to each other. Stories were repeated. Advice was shared again, even if it had been shared many times before. Elders spoke calmly, without urgency, reminding younger villagers of what had helped in years past. There was no panic in these moments. Panic required energy, and energy was something to be preserved. Instead, there was a quiet narrowing of focus. Life became smaller, more contained. The village turned inward. At night, the cold felt more present. Without the sun, the air pressed closer. Beds felt harder. Sleep came more slowly. People adjusted the way they lay, the way they covered themselves, the way they breathed. These small adjustments were often accompanied by thoughts. And thoughts, over time, shaped belief. If someone slept poorly, they might recall a rule they had forgotten. If a draft slipped through the wall, it might be remembered as a warning. The cold encouraged interpretation. It invited meaning. This was not fear in a sharp sense. It was awareness, a sense that winter required respect, that it noticed carelessness, that it rewarded preparation. These ideas did not need to be proven. They simply needed to feel consistent. As days passed, the first cold settled into something more stable. It became part of the background, and with it came acceptance. People stopped commenting on the temperature and started adjusting to it. They wore heavier clothing without remark. They moved more slowly without complaint. And yet, beneath this calm adjustment, thinking had shifted. Winter was no longer approaching. It was present. And with its presence came a subtle change in how people understood their place within it. Beliefs, at this stage, were still gentle. They had not yet grown elaborate or strict. They were reminders rather than rules, suggestions rather than commands. But they laid the foundation for what would follow as the season deepened. For now, villagers focused on getting through each day with steadiness. They trusted routines, they trusted habits, and they trusted that winter, if met with quiet care, would pass as it always had. Not quickly, but eventually. As winter settled more firmly into place, the nights began to stretch. They lengthened quietly, almost without notice at first, until one evening the darkness seemed to arrive before people felt ready for it. The light faded earlier, and it faded completely. Once the sun slipped away, it did not linger. It left behind a depth of darkness that felt heavy and unmoving. In medieval villages, light was never abundant, but in winter, it became precious. Candles were few, and they were saved. Tallow was measured carefully. Flames were kept low and steady, not bright. Light was something you used sparingly, the way you used warmth or food. As a result, much of the night passed in shadow. Rooms that felt familiar during the day changed after dusk. Corners softened, shapes blurred. The boundaries of walls and furniture became less certain. People learned the spaces of their homes by memory, not by sight. Each step was placed carefully. Each movement was slower than before. In this darkness, listening became more important than seeing. The crackle of the fire, the settling of wood, the faint sound of wind against the walls. These sounds were normal, expected, and yet, when the nights grew long, they invited attention. People noticed them more. They noticed when a sound was absent or when it lingered longer than usual. It was during these nights that beliefs began to deepen. Not suddenly and not dramatically. Belief grew in the quiet spaces, in the moments when there was nothing else to occupy the mind. When the body was still and the room was dark, thoughts wandered. And when thoughts wandered often enough along the same paths, they left marks. People began to speak of the night as something different from the day. Not dangerous, exactly, but uncertain. The day could be seen. The night had to be felt. And what could not be seen was often explained in other ways. A candle guttering unexpectedly might be taken as a sign to end the evening early. A sudden draft might be interpreted as a reminder to close a door more carefully next time. These interpretations were rarely discussed at length. They were shared briefly, quietly, and accepted without argument. The lack of light encouraged imagination, but it also encouraged restraint. People did not rush to invent stories. They preferred simple explanations that fit into what they already knew. Winter, darkness, fatigue, all of these worked together to make life feel narrower. At bedtime, this narrowing became more pronounced. Beds were simple. Coverings were heavy, but not always warm enough. Sleep came in pieces. People woke often listening. In these moments between sleeping and waking, the mind was especially receptive. Half-formed thoughts felt more solid. Old warnings felt more relevant. This was when certain nighttime rules became important. Not rules written down or enforced, but habits that felt necessary. Candles were placed in specific spots. Tools were left where they could be found in the dark. Nothing important was left on the floor where it might be stumbled over. Some believed that disorder invited trouble. Others believed that quiet order kept the night calm. Whether or not these beliefs were spoken aloud, they were practiced. Darkness also made people more aware of absence. The absence of sound, the absence of movement, the absence of reassurance. These absences were not frightening on their own, but they were noticeable. And what is noticed often becomes meaningful. Villagers did not fill the darkness with noise. They did not try to push it away. Instead, they accepted it as part of winter's rhythm. The night was long. It would be endured. Over time, certain explanations became familiar. If someone slept poorly, it was said the night had been restless. If a candle burned down too quickly, it was said the air had changed. These phrases did not demand proof. They offered comfort. The growth of belief during these nights was gradual. It did not replace reason. It sat beside it. Practical care was still taken. Fires were still tended. Doors were still barred. Belief simply added a layer of meaning to actions that were already necessary. In this way, superstition grew quietly. It was shaped by darkness, by fatigue, and by repetition. Each night reinforced the last. Each winter strengthened what had been believed before. And as the nights continued to lengthen, people adjusted not only their routines, but their expectations. They stopped asking for ease. They focused instead on steadiness, on getting through one night and then the next. Light would return eventually. Everyone knew this. But for now, darkness was the condition of living, and belief was one of the ways people learned to rest within it. As winter settled fully into the village, it was no longer spoken of as something passing through. It became something that stayed, something that occupied space, time, and thought. People did not describe winter as harsh or cruel in the way we might today. Instead, they spoke of it as deliberate, quiet, deciding. Winter was understood less as an event and more as a condition. In the long months of cold, villagers began to speak about winter as if it had intention. Not intention in a dramatic sense, but in a steady, unquestioned way. Winter arrived. Winter remained. Winter left when it was ready. This way of thinking did not come from fear alone. It came from observation repeated across generations. Each year, the season shaped outcomes. Some stores lasted. Others did not. Some bodies endured. Others weakened. These results were not always predictable, and they were rarely explained in detail. Instead, they were accepted as part of how winter worked. This acceptance gave rise to the idea of winter as something that chose. Not actively, and not with judgment, but with consistency. Winter followed its own rules. People believed that those rules could be respected, even if they could not be changed. In respect, they felt mattered. Villagers spoke quietly about winters past, about years when the cold lingered longer than expected, about nights when fires burned lower than planned, about mornings when someone did not rise from their bed. These memories were not shared with emotion. They were shared as reminders. Winter, they believed, noticed patterns. It noticed when people rushed. It noticed when preparation was careless. It noticed when rules were ignored. These ideas did not require proof. They were reinforced by repetition. Every winter offered examples that seemed to confirm them. When something went wrong, there was always a detail that could be pointed to. A door left unsealed. A warning overlooked. A custom forgotten. In this way, winter became something that responded. People did not fight this idea. It offered a sense of order. If winter followed rules, then people could follow rules too. And in following them, they felt less helpless. This belief shaped behavior in subtle ways. Movements became more deliberate. Words were chosen more carefully. Certain actions were avoided entirely once winter had fully arrived. Not because they were forbidden, but because they were considered unwise. Villagers believed that winter tested restraint. Those who conserved their strength were thought to fare better. Those who pushed themselves unnecessarily were said to invite trouble. Rest was no longer laziness. It was preparation. Silence was no longer emptiness. It was protection. Even illness was framed through this understanding. Sickness in winter was not always blamed on chance. It was sometimes described as winter pressing too hard on a weakened body. The language softened the reality. It placed responsibility not on the person, but on the season itself. When someone recovered, it was said winter had loosened its hold. When someone did not, it was said winter had not yet finished. These phrases allowed grief to exist without sharp edges. They allowed loss to be acknowledged without anger. At night, when a village was still, winter felt closest. The cold pressed against walls. The dark filled spaces that daylight usually softened. In these moments, people imagined winter listening, not in a threatening way, but in a watchful one. This encouraged quiet behavior. Loud actions were avoided. Sudden movements were discouraged. Even thoughts felt slower, heavier. People learned to move through winter gently, as if not to disturb it. Children absorbed these ideas without question. They learned when to speak softly, when to stay close to the fire, when to wait. Winter shaped their understanding of patience before they had words for it. The belief in winter as a living will did not bring comfort in the modern sense. It brought clarity. Winter was not random. It followed its course, and people, by paying attention, hoped to follow along without being left behind. As the season deepened, this way of thinking became second nature. No one needed to explain it anymore. It was simply how winter was understood. Something that could not be hurried. Something that could not be argued with. Only endured. As winter settled into its longest stretch, the hearth became the quiet center of each home. It was not treated as a place of comfort alone, but as something closer to a responsibility. The fire was watched, tended, and spoken of with care. Its presence meant warmth, light, and the possibility of another night passed safely. Fire was never taken for granted. Villagers understood that a fire did not simply exist. It needed attention. What had to be gathered earlier in the day, when light was still available. Pieces were chosen carefully, neither too large nor too small. A fire built too quickly could waste fuel. A fire built too slowly could fade before morning. These practical concerns were accompanied by quiet rituals, not ceremonies and not formal prayers, but habits repeated so often they became invisible. The way a log was placed, the way embers were spread before sleep, the way ash was smoothed rather than scattered. Ash, in particular, held meaning. At the end of the night, ash remained when flame had withdrawn. It was evidence that the fire had endured, even if only faintly. Many believed ash carried protection. It marked the boundary between warmth and cold, between the living interior and the winter pressing outside. Some households left a thin layer of ash covering the embers before sleeping. Not only to preserve heat, but because it felt right, ash was thought to quiet the fire, keeping it from drawing unwanted attention. A covered hearth felt safer than an exposed one. In the morning, ash was examined quietly. Its pattern told a story. A hearth that held warmth through the night was a good sign. A hearth that cooled completely invited concern. Not panic, but attention. Something had been missed. Ash was also moved carefully. It was not thrown away carelessly in winter. It was placed deliberately, often near thresholds or outside walls. These actions served practical purposes, but they also carried belief. Ash marked where warmth had been and where it was hoped to return. Fire shaped the rhythm of the household. People gathered near it without speaking much. They rested in its presence. They adjusted their positions slowly, always aware of its limits. Too close was uncomfortable. Too far was dangerous. As night fell, the tending of the fire became a shared responsibility. Someone checked the fuel. Someone else ensured nothing flammable was too near. Children were taught early to respect the hearth, not as something sacred, but as something necessary. Beliefs around fire were shaped by experience. Fires that burned too brightly could be just as threatening as fires that faded too soon. Balance mattered. Moderation mattered. This understanding extended into ritual. Some households avoided lighting a fire after a certain hour once winter had fully arrived. Others believed a fire should never be left unattended, even briefly, during the coldest months. These rules varied from place to place, but their purpose was the same. They offered structure. Ash was sometimes used as a marker of protection. A small line drawn near a doorway. A handful placed near stored goods. These actions were rarely explained. They were learned by watching, and they were repeated without question. If something went wrong, a fire sputtered unexpectedly, or embers cooled too quickly, people looked first to their habits. Had something been done out of order? Had a step been skipped? The search for cause was calm, not anxious. Fire, after all, was a companion through winter. It required patience. It rewarded attention. And it reminded people that warmth was something maintained, not assumed. In the quiet hours before sleep, the hearth was the last thing many people looked at. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The glow of embers offered reassurance. It suggested continuity. The night would pass, slowly, as it always did. Ash settled. Fire rested, and the household followed. When the fire had been settled for the night, and the household grew quiet, attention turned towards sleep. Sleep in winter was not approached casually. It was understood as a vulnerable state, a time when the body rested but the world did not pause. The cold continued, the dark remained, and so the way one slept mattered. Beds were simple and often shared. They were placed where warmth lingered longest, not where comfort was greatest. Straw mattresses were packed tightly. Woolen coverings were layered carefully. Each item had its place, and its absence was noticed. Before lying down, many followed small, familiar rules. Shoes were positioned carefully. Tools were kept within reach, but not too close. Nothing important was left scattered on the floor. These habits served practical purposes, but they also carried meaning. Order before sleep was believed to invite steadier rest. Sleeping positions mattered. Some believed it was unwise to sleep facing the door during winter nights. Others avoided sleeping with feet pointed toward the hearth. These beliefs were rarely explained fully. They were accepted because they had always been followed, and because breaking them felt uncomfortable, even if no harm followed immediately. The night itself was treated with quiet respect. People did not speak loudly once they lay down. Conversations faded into whispers or stopped altogether. Sound carried differently in winter, and silence was considered safer. In these long nights, waking was common. People stirred often, adjusting coverings, listening. When they woke, they did not rush to move. They lay still first, sensing the room, the temperature, the sounds, the presence of others nearby. These moments between sleeping and waking were when nighttime warnings were remembered. A strange noise might recall an old saying. A sudden chill might bring to mind a forgotten habit. These warnings were not shouted. They arrived gently as thoughts, and they were treated seriously. Some believed that opening the door at night during winter invited trouble. Others believed that stepping outside unnecessarily weakened the body. These ideas reinforced caution. They kept people inside, conserving warmth and strength. Children were taught these rules early, not through fear, but through repetition. Stay still. Keep close. Wait until morning. These phrases were spoken softly, often without explanation. Over time, they became instinct. Objects near the bed were chosen carefully. A knife, a tool, or a piece of wood might be kept nearby, not for use but for reassurance. Familiar objects provided comfort. They reminded the sleeper that they were not alone. Some households believed that certain items should never be moved once placed for the night. Others believed that changing the arrangement disturbed the balance of the room. Whether or not these beliefs were shared openly, they shaped behavior. If someone slept poorly, it was rarely blamed on chance. A reason was sought. Perhaps a rule had been overlooked. Perhaps the night itself had been unsettled. These explanations softened frustration. They offered something to correct next time. Sleep, in winter, was not expected to be deep or uninterrupted. It was something taken in portions. Rest was gathered gradually over many nights. And so, anything that promised steadier sleep was valued. Nighttime warnings were part of this promise. They guided behavior without demanding effort. They reminded people to be cautious, to conserve, to wait. As the night passed slowly, bodies learned to rest within these boundaries. Belief did not prevent waking, but it gave waking moments shape. It made them feel purposeful rather than anxious. And when morning finally arrived, even faintly, there was relief. Another night had been endured. The rules had held. The warnings had been respected. Sleep, imperfect but sufficient, had done its work. As winter deepened, attention shifted quietly toward food, not in moments of hunger, but in the careful watching of what remained. Stores were checked more often. Containers were opened and closed with deliberation. Nothing was wasted without thought. Food, like warmth, became something measured over time. In medieval households, storage was never abundant. What had been gathered during warmer months now rested in dark corners, cellars, and hanging bundles. Grain sacks were tied tightly. Dried meats were inspected by touch rather than sight. Root vegetables were handled gently, as if roughness might shorten their usefulness. These practical acts were accompanied by belief. People believed that food responded to care, that it kept better when treated with respect. A loaf of bread was broken carefully not torn. Salt was handled sparingly. Nothing was spoken over food that might invite spoilage. These habits were not dramatic. They were quiet, steady, and deeply ingrained. Some households believed that counting stored food, too, often brought misfortune. Others believed that speaking openly about shortage invited it. And so, people checked supplies silently. They remembered quantities without announcing them. Knowledge was kept private. Food was also tied to timing. Certain days were considered better for opening stores than others. Certain hours were avoided. These beliefs varied from village to village, but their purpose was the same. They offered structure. They gave people the sense that even scarcity followed rules. Meals in winter were smaller and slower. Eating was unhurried. Each bite was taken with awareness. Not gratitude in a formal sense, but attentiveness. The body noticed nourishment more keenly when it was limited. Children learned early not to ask for more. They learned to wait. They learned that fullness felt different in winter. These lessons were absorbed quietly, without explanation. Storage spaces themselves were treated with care. Doors were closed gently. Containers were returned to the same place each time. Disorder was avoided. A well-kept storage area was believed to protect what it held. Mess invited loss. If food spoiled unexpectedly, it was rarely dismissed as chance. A reason was sought. Perhaps something had been left uncovered. Perhaps a rule had been ignored. These explanations softened disappointment. They gave people something to adjust. Some believed that placing certain objects near food kept it safe. A piece of iron, a marking on a container, a symbol scratched lightly into wood. These practices were often inherited, passed down without question. Winter made food feel precious not only because it was limited, but because it represented continuity. Each meal meant another day endured. Each store preserved meant another week approached with steadiness. Superstition offered control where control was otherwise limited. It allowed people to feel involved in outcomes they could not fully command. By following rules, they felt aligned with the season rather than opposed to it. As winter continued, food became less about comfort and more about maintenance. Eating was part of survival, but it was also part of routine. A way to mark time. Morning, midday, evening. And when stores began to thin, belief grew stronger. Rules were followed more carefully. Habits were repeated without variation. Attention sharpened, not from fear, but from understanding. Winter did not respond to panic. It responded to patience. And so people waited, carefully, quietly, one meal at a time. As winter moved beyond the household and into the shared spaces of the village, people began to look outward for guidance. Not for certainty, but for hints. Signs were noticed, not because villagers expected answers, but because attention had already been sharpened by the season. Winter encouraged watching. The natural world, quieter now, seemed more deliberate. Animals behaved differently. Livestock moved less. Birds appeared and disappeared without pattern. Dogs paused before entering certain spaces, as if listening to something unheard. These small changes were observed closely. They were spoken of quietly, often in passing, but rarely ignored. A bird calling at the wrong hour might be mentioned, not with alarm, but with curiosity. A sudden absence of sound in the morning could invite reflection. People did not rush to interpret these signs. They allowed meaning to settle slowly. The wind was another source of attention. Its direction, its steadiness, its sound against walls and trees. A sharp wind was considered different from a steady one. Each suggested something about the days ahead. These interpretations were not uniform. They shifted with experience and memory. Villagers believed winter spoke through patterns rather than words. A cracked beam in the cold. A door that creaked more than usual. A well that froze earlier than expected. These things were not feared, but noted. They were added to a growing understanding of the season. Each sign joined many others, forming a quiet record. Omens were rarely announced loudly. They were shared in calm voices, often among a few people at a time. This limited their weight. A sign acknowledged quietly felt manageable. Spoken too loudly, it might grow heavy. Some villagers believed it was unwise to ignore signs. Others believed it was unwise to dwell on them. Balance mattered. attention without obsession, awareness without fear. Children learned these habits by listening. They heard adults mention the way frost lingered on certain stones, the way smoke rose differently on certain mornings. These observations were not lessons in fear, but lessons in patience. Winter warnings were often indirect. They suggested caution rather than demanded action. A sign might encourage earlier preparation, or more careful storage, or less movement. Rarely did it prompt sudden change. This approach matched the pace of winter itself. Nothing moved quickly. Nothing resolved suddenly. Everything unfolded slowly, over weeks and months. People also believed that winter repeated itself, but never exactly. Each year offered similarities, but also differences. This kept observation relevant. Past experience guided attention, but did not replace it. When several signs appeared together, they were discussed more seriously. Not with urgency, but with respect. The village adjusted gently. Tasks were reprioritized. Travel was delayed. Supplies were checked again. These adjustments were not dramatic. They were small shifts. But small shifts mattered in winter. The belief in signs and omens gave people a sense of participation. They were not passive. They were listening, responding, adapting. This involvement helped maintain calm. If a warning proved unnecessary, it was not seen as failure. It was seen as caution well spent. Winter, after all, rewarded restraint more often than boldness. As days passed and signs continued to appear and fade, villagers grew accustomed to this quiet dialogue with their environment. They did not expect certainty. They expected guidance. And so they watched. They listened. They waited. Winter offered no guarantees, only patterns. And in those patterns, people found a way to endure. As winter tightened its hold on the village, there were absences that could not be ignored, not spoken of directly and rarely addressed at length, but noticed all the same. A place at the hearth left empty, a task taken up by someone else, a familiar sound no longer heard in the morning. In winter, death was not treated as an interruption. It was treated as a quiet outcome, something that arrived without ceremony and settled into daily life without explanation. People did not dramatize it. They did not ask why in loud voices. Winter was understood to decide some things without consultation. When someone died during the cold months, there was often little that could be done immediately. The ground was hard. The soil resisted digging. Burial, when it happened, was sometimes delayed. This was accepted without protest. The season imposed its limits, and people lived within them. The dead were kept close, but not disturbed. Bodies were laid out simply, covered carefully. The room grew quieter than usual, not from fear, but from respect. People moved gently, speaking only when necessary. The presence of death did not bring chaos. It brought stillness. Winter encouraged this stillness. It slowed reactions. It softened expressions of grief. People grieved quietly, conserving energy, preserving routine. The work of survival continued alongside loss. Children noticed these changes without being told. They noticed the way adults lowered their voices, the way tasks were reassigned, the way certain paths were avoided for a time. These observations became part of their understanding of winter. The ground itself was part of this understanding. Frozen earth was seen as closed, not hostile, but unyielding. It accepted nothing new until the season changed. This lent winter an air of finality. What happened during winter was carried forward into spring, unresolved but remembered. People believed that winter held the dead differently than other seasons. The cold preserved silence. It kept things still. Some believed the dead rested more deeply in winter. Others believed they lingered quietly, waiting for warmth to return. These beliefs were not discussed openly. They were felt. Villagers avoided disturbing certain places during winter. Old paths, burial grounds, areas where the earth had been broken before. This avoidance was not based on fear of spirits, but on respect for the season's boundaries. If someone did not survive the winter, it was rarely framed as a failure. It was said simply that winter had been heavy, that the body had grown tired, that not everyone saw morning again. These phrases carried no accusation. The silence that followed death blended into the larger silence of winter. It was absorbed by it. Loss became part of the background, acknowledged but not constantly revisited. Rituals around death were modest. A prayer spoken quietly. A gesture made without flourish. Winter did not allow for long ceremonies. It required efficiency, even in grief. People trusted that time would provide space for remembrance later. Spring would come. The ground would soften. Words could be spoken then. For now, restraint was necessary. This approach to death was shaped by necessity, but it also shaped belief. Winter taught people to accept limits, to hold grief without letting it consume strength needed for survival. The cold ground remained untouched, holding what it held. Silence settled. Life continued in careful patterns. And so, winter carried both the living and the dead without distinction. It pressed gently, steadily, reminding everyone of what endured and what had not. As winter continued, silence became the most familiar condition of village life. Not an empty silence, but a settled one. The kind that rests over everything without needing explanation. Sounds still existed, but they were fewer, softer, and more spaced apart. Each one stood alone before fading back into quiet. People adjusted to this without comment. Days passed with little variation. The same paths were walked. The same tasks were completed. The same hours were spent indoors, close to warmth. Time moved slowly, but predictably. This predictability was a form of comfort. Waiting became part of daily routine. Waiting for light. Waiting for warmth. Waiting for the fire to respond. Waiting for sleep to return. These waits were not impatient. Impatience required energy, and winter allowed little room for it. Instead, people learned to wait with stillness, with acceptance. Silence encouraged listening, not for danger, but for reassurance. A familiar sound confirmed continuity. The creak of a beam, the breath of someone nearby, the quiet movement of animals in their stalls. These sounds meant life continued, even if it did so quietly. Endurance in winter was rarely celebrated. It was not something people spoke of proudly. It was simply expected. The body learned to conserve itself. Movements became efficient. Gestures unnecessary in warmer months were abandoned. Conversation followed the same pattern. Words were used carefully. Nothing was wasted. Silence filled the spaces between speech without discomfort. People believed that winter favored those who did not resist it. Those who accepted stillness, who rested when possible, who avoided unnecessary effort. Endurance was not about strength alone. It was about restraint. Children learned this early. They learned that boredom was not something to fight. It was something to pass through, sitting quietly by the fire, watching embers fade and brighten again. These moments trained patience. The village as a whole moved less. Travel was reduced. Visitors were rare. When someone did arrive, they were received quietly without surprise. Winter limited movement, and this was understood. Silence also shaped belief. In the absence of distraction, people noticed patterns in their own thoughts. Memories surfaced. Old warnings returned. Beliefs that might have faded during busy seasons found space again. Waiting allowed these ideas to settle deeper. People did not expect winter to improve. They expected it to continue until it was finished. This expectation removed disappointment. Each day endured was sufficient. When storms passed without damage, it was noted quietly. When supplies held longer than expected, it was appreciated without celebration. Small successes were enough. Endurance did not mean optimism. It meant steadiness, a willingness to continue without assurance of comfort. Winter did not reward hope. It rewarded patience. As weeks blended together, the village existed in a state of quiet persistence. No one rushed ahead mentally. The future was held loosely. Attention remained on the present moment. And in this state, belief served its final purpose. It helped people endure without feeling lost. It gave shape to waiting. It made silence feel intentional rather than empty. Winter was not something to defeat. It was something to outlast. And so, the village waited, calmly, carefully, one quiet day after another. As winter stretched toward its later days, a subtle change began to move through the village. It did not arrive suddenly. It was not celebrated. It was felt slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the season itself were loosening its hold without announcing its intentions. The cold remained, but it behaved differently. Mornings grew slightly brighter, not warm and not inviting, but brighter enough to notice. Light lingered longer along the edges of the day. Shadows shifted their positions. The sun rose just enough to remind people that it still existed. Villagers noticed these changes without speaking of them openly. Winter had taught restraint, and that restraint remained. Hope, when it appeared, was handled carefully. Too much attention might disturb it. Beliefs that had guided the darkest months began to soften. Not disappear, but relax. Certain rules were followed less strictly. Certain warnings were remembered without urgency. This was not carelessness. It was adjustment. Late winter demanded patience of a different kind. People still moved slowly, but there was less heaviness in their movements. Tasks felt marginally easier. The body responded differently to the cold, no longer fighting it in the same way. Fatigue remained, but was no longer constant. The hearth continued to be watched, but with less tension. Fires were allowed to burn a little brighter. Ash was handled with the same care, but without the same caution. These small changes reflected a growing sense that winter was no longer deciding everything. Food stores were still measured, but calculations shifted. People allowed themselves to think ahead, not to abundance, but to continuation. They counted not just days, but weeks. Beliefs tied to strict survival began to fade into habit. They were no longer urgent instructions. They became reminders of what had carried people through. The tone changed from necessity to memory. Villagers spoke more during the evenings. Conversations lasted longer. Silence still existed, but it was no longer the dominant presence. Laughter did not return fully, but voices softened. Children noticed this shift first. They sensed permission to move a little more freely, to speak a little louder, to ask questions again. These small freedoms marked the change more clearly than any calendar could. Superstitions were not abandoned. They were respected, but no longer clung to. People understood that winter required them most when it was strongest. Now its strength was waning. Late winter carried its own risks. This was understood. Fatigue accumulated over months could still overwhelm. Supplies could still fail. Bodies could still weaken. And so, caution remained. But fear did not. The idea of winter as a deciding force softened. It was still present, but less demanding. People no longer spoke of winter choosing outcomes. They spoke instead of enduring it nearly to its end. This shift affected belief. Superstitions lost their edge. They became part of the background, rather than the center of attention. People relied more on experience than warning. Yet, these beliefs were not forgotten. They were stored like tools placed carefully aside. They would be needed again. Everyone knew this. Winter always returned. For now, the village existed in a quiet in-between state. Not yet free of winter, but no longer fully bound by it. This space required gentleness. Pushing too soon would invite trouble. And so, people waited differently now, with cautious anticipation, with restrained relief, with the understanding that endurance had worked. Winter had not been defeated. It was simply passing. As late winter edged closer to its end, attention shifted gently toward those who remained. Not in a counting sense, and not spoken aloud, but noticed all the same. The village felt familiar, yet altered. Small changes had accumulated quietly over the months, leaving marks that would not disappear with the snow. Survival in winter was never dramatic. It was gradual. It revealed itself in who continued their routines, who took on new tasks, and who carried responsibilities that once belonged to others. These shifts were accepted without comment. Winter rearranged roles without asking permission. People remembered. They remembered who had endured previous winters, who had offered help, who had grown quieter. These memories were not held with judgment. They were held as knowledge. Useful, steady knowledge that would guide future seasons. Memory in the village was practical. It did not dwell on events. It focused on outcomes. which storage methods had lasted longest, which households had prepared well, which habits had brought steadiness. These observations became part of shared understanding. Survivors carried winter in their bodies. Fatigue lingered. Movements remained careful. Even as daylight increased, people did not rush. They knew that strength returned slowly. Pushing too early risked undoing months of restraint. Quiet change appeared everywhere. Tools were moved to new places. Sleeping arrangements shifted. Some routines were abandoned. Others were reinforced. These changes were not announced. They happened gradually, shaped by necessity rather than intention. Beliefs adjusted alongside them. Superstitions that had felt essential now felt optional. Still respected, but not relied upon in the same way. People trusted experience more now. They trusted what had worked. Loss, when remembered, was handled gently. Names were spoken quietly. Absence was acknowledged without ceremony. Winter had taken some things with it. This was accepted without bitterness. Children absorbed these changes deeply. They noticed who spoke less, who spoke more, who carried knowledge quietly. These observations shaped their understanding of winter far more than any instruction. The village began to feel outward-facing again, not open, but receptive. People looked beyond their homes more often. They noticed the sky, the edges of fields, the state of paths once abandoned. This outward attention marked a shift. Winter had required inward focus. Survival had depended on containment. Now, the village slowly expanded its awareness. Memory ensured that this expansion was cautious. Stories of past winters were told differently now, not as warnings, but as reminders. That year lasted longer. That year required patience. These phrases were spoken calmly, without emotion. Survivors understood that winter left traces even after it passed. The body remembered. The village remembered. Belief remembered. Quiet change meant carrying these memories forward without letting them harden into fear. Experience softened belief. It made it flexible. The village did not celebrate survival. It accepted it. Endurance was not something earned. It was something completed. As the season loosened further, people began preparing without urgency. Repairs were planned. Tools were checked. The future was acknowledged without excitement. Winter had shaped them again, as it always did. And in its wake, the village stood changed but steady, holding memory not as burden, but as guide. Even before winter fully released its hold, preparation quietly began again. Not because people were eager, and not because they feared what had passed, but because experience had taught them that waiting too long was unwise. Winter did not need to be near to be remembered. Its lessons remained clear. Preparation did not look like urgency. It appeared as small decisions made without discussion. A tool repaired instead of set aside. A storage space cleared and cleaned more carefully than necessary, which stacked a little higher than last year. These actions were taken calmly, without the tension that had marked earlier months. The village understood that winter was cyclical. It did not arrive as punishment, nor did it depart as reward. It returned because it always did. Preparing for it was not an act of fear. It was an act of acceptance. Beliefs played a quieter role now. Superstitions that had guided survival were reviewed mentally, not followed strictly. People remembered which rituals had brought comfort, which habits had preserved strength, and which rules had added unnecessary strain. This reflection was private. Each household adjusted differently. Some practices were kept out of respect rather than belief. A gesture repeated because it felt right. A rule observed because it encouraged care. These actions no longer carried urgency. They carried familiarity. Children were included gently in preparation, not through instruction, but through observation. They watched adults choose certain methods over others. They noticed caution without anxiety. This taught them more than words ever could. The physical environment also signaled preparation. Fields were assessed differently now. Paths were noted. Weak points in structures were remembered. These observations were not dramatic. They were integrated into routine. Winter had taught people where limits lay. Preparing for the next winter meant acknowledging those limits honestly, not expecting more strength than the body could offer, not assuming conditions would improve simply because they once had. This realism shaped belief more than superstition ever did. There was also restraint in preparation. People avoided overcompensating. Excess required energy to maintain, and energy was always limited. Preparation aimed for balance, not abundance. Villagers spoke rarely about the next winter directly. When they did, it was without emotion. "We will be ready." This phrase carried no bravado. It was a statement of intent, not confidence. The memory of silence remained strong. People remembered how winter had quieted everything. This influenced how they organized space, how they arranged sleeping areas, how they planned work. Quiet was treated as a condition to be accommodated, not resisted. Beliefs adjusted accordingly. Winter was no longer framed as a force to appease. It was framed as a condition to endure. This subtle shift reduced fear. It replaced uncertainty with familiarity. As preparation continued, the village maintained its calm pace. No one rushed to reclaim lost time. The rhythm established during winter lingered. People continued to move slowly, conserving strength even as warmth hinted at return. This continuity was intentional. Abrupt change unsettled the body. Winter taught gradualism. And so, as days lengthened and the ground softened, preparation remained quiet. No ceremonies marked it. No announcements were made. The village simply adjusted, as it always had. Winter would come again, not as a surprise, not as a threat, but as a known presence. And when it did, the village would meet it with memory, restraint, and steady endurance. As winter finally loosened its hold and withdrew without ceremony, it left behind very little that could be pointed to directly. No clear moment marked its ending. No sound announced its departure. It simply became less present day by day until it was no longer the dominant force shaping every thought. What remained was memory, not the sharp kind and not the dramatic kind. Winter was remembered quietly, the way the body remembers a long stillness, or the way the mind recalls a season of waiting without replaying every moment. Its weight softened with time, but it did not disappear. Villagers carried winter forward in subtle ways, in how carefully they moved even after the ground thawed, in how they continued to listen for sounds in the night, even when nights grew shorter, in how silence no longer felt empty, but familiar. The beliefs that had shaped the cold months did not vanish. They settled. Some became habits. Others became stories told without urgency. A few faded entirely, no longer needed. Winter decided which ones remained, not through force, but through repetition. People did not speak often about what winter had taken. Loss was acknowledged without emphasis. The absence of certain voices was noticed, then folded into daily life. Grief, like the cold, had been endured quietly. It did not demand expression now. Instead, attention turned gently toward comfort. The simple comfort of warmth returning slowly. The comfort of light lasting a little longer. The comfort of knowing that stillness could be survived. These comforts were not celebrated loudly. Winter had taught restraint too well for that. Relief was handled carefully, almost cautiously, as if drawing too much attention to it might disturb its balance. Children returned to movement first. They tested the world again, gradually, without instruction. Adults watched without comment. There was trust in this process. Life resumed at its own pace. The village itself retained a quieter rhythm than before. Winter had altered it. Conversations remained measured. Nights remained calm. Even work was approached with more care. Winter's influence lingered not as fear, but as awareness. People understood now that belief was not only about protection. It was also about patience. The rituals, the superstitions, the warnings, all of them had served a purpose. They had given structure to waiting, meaning to endurance. And when belief was no longer needed in the same way, it stepped back without resistance. Winter did not need to be explained. It had been experienced. In later months, when stories were told, winter was spoken of simply. That year was quiet. That year required patience. These phrases carried weight, but not emotion. They were statements of fact. Time softened the edges. What had once felt heavy became manageable in memory. The body relaxed its guard. The mind released its tension. Winter remained, but only as background. This quiet remembrance was important. It allowed people to move forward without forgetting, to prepare without fear, to endure again if needed. As you rest now, listening quietly, there is no need to hold onto every detail of winter's story. You can allow it to fade gently, the way it did for the village. What matters is not what was survived, but that it was. Winter passed. Silence endured. Life continued. And so, as the story settles and the night grows still again, you may find yourself resting more easily. The season has done its work. There is nothing left to watch for, nothing left to prepare. Only quiet, only rest, only the slow passing of time. Sleep can come gently now, carrying with it the calm knowledge that even the longest winters are remembered softly and then allowed to fade.